Pesahim daf 48. We are starting off with interesting discussion trying to correlate two different subjects that we've already seen. The first one is the Mishnah that we're discussing. If you have you're baking masa on Pesach on Yom Tov itself, and the problem is that the dough is Tameh, so that means you have to bring Hallah that you're going to give to the Kohen. But it is Tameh, so no, the Kohen can't eat it. You can't eat it either because it's Hallah. And now you have to, if you leave it out, it's going to become Hametz. That's not good. And you can't put it in the oven because you can't, no one can eat it. So you can't cook something that you can't eat. So this was the puzzle we had before. And there are three possibilities for a solution. Eliezer says, bake them all, assuming that I could eat any one of them. And since each and every one, I could say, I was going to eat that one. So then that's fine. I bake them all as food. And then only afterwards, after they're baked, do I separate it. And Ben Betera said, just put them all in cold water. It won't leaven in cold water. Not put the Hallah. Separate Hallah from the dough, put in cold water. And Yehoshua says, separate Hallah as dough and put it on the counter and let it leaven. No one cares. It's not your problem because lo yireh lecha chametz, and this belongs to the Kohen. It's kodesh, and it doesn't belong to you, so you don't have to worry about it. Good. That was a three-way machloket. Now we saw a second machloket between Rabbah and Rav Hisda. These are the first ones are Tanaim. These are now Amoraim, and they say the principle of ho'il. Rabbah says we do apply the principle that potential is like actual, and therefore I'm allowed to cook on Yom Tov, even though I'm not going to eat. There's no way I'm going to eat and what I'm cooking because maybe guests will come. And since potentially guests could come, and then I would have it ready for them, even if they don't come, that's okay. And therefore, I'm allowed to cook from Yom Tov to Shabbat. And if I cook from Yom Tov to Chol, not get lashes. That's Rabbah. Rav Hisda, however, does not apply the principle of Ho'il. So now we're going to try to do Rami bar Chama, who's a third generation Amorah, is going to try to correlate 1 and A, 3 and B. Since the Eliezer says ho'il, since you could eventually separate one of them, any one of them right now is not necessarily the one that's challah. So as I'm putting in the oven, this might be the one I'm going to eat. This could be the one I'm going to eat. So you see, he has some kind of concept of potential as like actual. So maybe he would agree with Rabbah. He's earlier, but maybe he would agree with the principle. The Yehoshua perhaps would agree with Rav Hisda because he says you don't say ho'il. That's why you need a different solution. So that's what he's going to try to do, correlate 1A and 3B. Then we're going to see a fifth generation discussion that will reject that and say, no, not necessarily. They can each follow any opinion. And then we're going to go backwards to a fourth generation Amoraic discussion about what would each respond to each other. Yirmiah accepts Rami bar Chama's statement, Rabbi Zeira rejects it, and we'll see why. Okay, so this is going to be very interesting. Amar Rami bar Chama, third generation Amorah, had Rav Hisda v'Rabbah machloket, did Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Yehoshua hi. It so happens that this Amoraic machloket lines up perfectly with the Tanaitic machloket, and we can explain now why each of these Tanaim provide the strategy that they do. Did Rabbi Eliezer sabat amrinan ho'il? Rabbi Eliezer said, you put it in the oven first, assuming that this one I might eat and might not be challah, so I could put them all in the oven with that principle in mind. And Rabbi Yehoshua sabat lo amrinan ho'il. Rabbi Yehoshua says I cannot use that principle, and therefore it would not be. Therefore, he has to find a different solution, which is just simply to leave it out. Okay, Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa rejects this. No, v'dilma ad kan laka amar Rabbi Eliezer hatam tamrinan ho'il ela de be'idana de ka aile letanura kol chada v'chada hazya ledideh. It says no. Rabbi Eliezer would only apply some concept of ho'il. In general, he would not apply it. Only in the case of the Hallah would he apply ho'il, since as he's putting each one in the oven, each one he can say, I'm going to eat this one, I'm going to eat that one. So it's totally in his power to actually decide to eat any particular one of them. So since he could do that for each and every one, so he can put the whole batch in the oven. But in the case of cooking on Yom Tov, since all of them would be for the guests. He already ate, so he's not hungry, so he's not going to eat any of this. So therefore, it's more of a stretch to say, oh, since guests can come, I can cook all of this, right? It's like in the case of Hallah, most of it is going to be kosher. Just one piece is going to be one that I have to apply oils. Well, since this could be, whereas if with the cooking for the guests, it's almost the whole batch that I have to use this principle. It's a bigger stretch. So not necessarily. The Eliezer might actually agree with Rav Hisda. Okay, and the other way also doesn't necessarily work. Amar Rav Shesha, bered Rav Iti, v'dilma lohi, ad kan lo kamar Rabbi Yehoshua hatam, de lo amrinan ho'il eladiga hada, de la hazia, lo lidide velo la orchin. Perhaps Rabbi Yehoshua would not apply ho'il in the case of the cooking for guests. In case of Hallah, he does not apply ho'il in the case. In general, he would apply a ho'il. In this case, he doesn't, because there is definitely one loaf that cannot be eaten by anybody. Right? Not for anyone. But in the case of cooking on Yom Tov, could be lots of guests will come and they will actually finish off all the food. So since in the case of Yom Tov, it's possible, the ho'il does encompass every single possibility that I can account for. So maybe he would actually agree with Rabbah. But in the case of Hallah, since there's for sure one item that is going to be uneaten and not allowed to eat, and I'm putting it in the oven, I'm definitely violating cooking on Yom Tov. Okay, so that's a way to think of it the opposite way. All right, these were fourth generation Amoraim, these were fifth generation Papa's fifth generation Amoraim, and now we're actually going to go backwards. So the following doesn't necessarily know of the rejection. Amaru harabanan kamet Rabbi Yirmiah v'Rabbi Zeira. So the rabbis presented the Rami bar hama statement from the third generation to these fourth generation Amoraim. And Rabbi Yirmiah kibela. Rabbi Yirmiah said, "Oh, that's fantastic. I like how it lines up. 1 and A, right? 3 and B. Those line up. They were arguing on the same concept: ho'il or not ho'il." But Rabbi Zeira lo kibela. Rabbi Zeira did not accept it. Amar le Rabbi Yirmiah le Rabbi Zeira milata tekashyalan ve'atya kama shene b'may peligi Rabbi Eliezer ve'Rabbi Yehoshua hashta maru mishemed gabra Rabbah la nekabela. So this amazing thing. He said, why aren't you accepting this? This is something that we've been struggling with for years. We have no solution. We can't explain. Why do Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua disagree? Why does one say you should put it in the oven and one say you leave it out? We could. And finally, now this great rabbi, Rami bar hama, comes and gives us an explanation. Why should we not accept it? Okay, good. Amale hechi akabela. It says no. How can Rabbi Zeira answers? How can I accept it? Look what I have. We have another Baraita. Detanena. Amale Rabbi Yehoshua. Lidbarecha. Rabbi Yehoshua, who said to leave it out, right? He says, according to you, lidbarecha harei over mishum lo taaseh kol melacha. According to you, Rabbi Eliezer, who says just put it in the oven and separate it later. I am violating doing melacha because I'm actually cooking on Yom Tov. One piece of this is not going to be eaten. And so, ve'shatekle, and Rabbi Eliezer had no answer. Ve'ita, but if he had the principle of ho'il, le'maleh tamadidi mishum ho'il, then you should have said, oh, I have an answer to you. It's not cooking because I can say, potentially I could eat this one, potentially I could eat that one. And therefore, I potentially could eat each and every one of them individually, and therefore it's allowed. So you see that since Rabbi Eliezer in this Baraita, Rabbi Eliezer does not provide an answer, and he does not provide the answer of ho'il, that means he didn't know about ho'il. That's why I cannot accept it. It's not found. If he knew it, that was his thought, he would have been found in the Tanaitic statement. All right, Rabbi Yirmiah says, Amar lev ta'amich had tanena babadaita. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer lidvarecha harei ober mishum bal yereu bal yamaseh v'shatikle. Says, wait, but the other side, he also doesn't have an answer, right? According to you, like look at how when Rabbi Eliezer challenges Rabbi Yehoshua and says, wait a second, how can you separate dough and just leave it on the counter? Then aren't you violating bal yereu bal yamaseh? And Rabbi Yehoshua was quiet; he had no answer. So hachename de la hadarle Are you going to say that he didn't have an answer? But we know he did have an answer. The Baraita does not record an answer, but our Mishnah does record the answer. Yehoshua says, this is not what we mean by that only applies to your chametz that you own. But if it's owned by a non-Jew, if it's owned by Gaboa, it's owned by the Bet HaMikdash, and you gave it away to a Kohen, you gave it away as you designate it as Hallah, it's not yours anymore, and you don't violate. So you see, even though in the Baraita he didn't answer, in the Mishnah, the Yehoshua did give a response. So just because there's no response in the Baraita doesn't mean he didn't have a response. Just means that the Baraita did not record it. Ella shatek le Baraita u'madele matitin. You're right. In the Baraita he was quiet, but he answered it in the Mishnah. Right? We don't have to record everything in every place. So here, so too here. You're right. He didn't. There's no response in our Mishnah. There's no response of Rabbi Eliezer in the Baraita either. But maybe there's some other place that he recorded that, and maybe in that place he in fact said ho'il, and that's and he would have an answer. So that for that reason, Rabbi Yirmiah accepted the principle and the application of Ami Bar Chama, and he said, yes, we can line this up. It works nicely. Rabbi Eliezer says Ho'il, just like Rabbah. Rabbi Yehoshua does not say Ho'il, just like Rav Hisda, but Rabbi Zeira rejects it. Okay, so that ends that discussion. Just one more point about this. I find it astounding that they say that we've been discussing this for years and we have no idea what the answer is. I hinted to this last class, but actually, I now remembering I recorded a whole class just on Pesach that I'll send you. I'll put the link in the chat regarding this machloket. Rabbi Yitzchak Gilat. He's a very, very important professor of history of halacha. He wrote an article about this, about chametz, and proved from many sources that the ancient halacha, which is represented here by Rabbi Eliezer, is that you have to get rid of chametz totally, whether you own it or don't own it. Right? Yeah, and in biblical times, you'd get rid of all chametz in the entire land, no matter where it was. It would be like a national banned substance. And so Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with Rabbi Yehoshua's reading of the pasuk, and so he says, "Right, lo yera'eh lecha." Rabbi Yehoshua says, "Only if it belongs to you." That is that's only Rabbi Yehoshua. The Rabbi Eliezer, who represents the older layer of halacha, would not agree to that. Okay, so we actually can figure out a good reason why Rabbi Eliezer said what he said, and it's not because of Ho'il, but the rabbis obviously like to try to correlate the ideas together and show principles that are linked throughout. Okay, so that's very interesting. And now we get to the question of what is the biggest amount of dough that's manageable to cook, to bake on Pesach itself, and not be too unwieldy that it will become chametz. If it's too big, you can't possibly knead the whole thing at the same time, and you can't put it in the oven quickly enough. And so this is the upper limit to how much you could do. Here, Tanya, Rabbi Omer. Oh, wait, before we get to that, who is halacha like? Rabbi Omer halacha ke Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yitzchak Omer amad halacha ke ben Betera. Okay, good. So we forgot about ben Betera. He said just put it in cold water and it'll stay unleavened until after Yom Tov, and then you could burn it after Yom Tov. All right, so machloket about what the halacha lamasa is going to be. Okay, kama shi'or isa. How big is a dough that will be manageable? Rabbi Yishmael beno shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka Omer bechitin kabayin besorin sheloshet kabayin. Regarding wheat is going to leaven a bit more quickly, and so only 2 kav of wheat should you bake at a time. Barley takes a little longer, so you can manage a 3 kabin. Rabbi Natan Omer Mishum Rabbi Eliezer Chilufa Debarim says no, the opposite. Wheat you could do 3 kabin, and barley is the one that's leavens more quickly and only 2. Good. Now, a question on the first opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. we see something else. He says, "V'hatanya Rabbi Yishmael beno shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Berak omer bechitin sheloshet kabin, besurin arba'a kabin." Here he said 2 and 3, but in another place he says 3 and 4 kabin for wheat and barley. So which seems to contradict himself. Lakasha bechasichata habem aliyata. No, this one here is talking about low quality grain, which does not leaven very quickly, and therefore you can handle more. Whereas this upper statement here was talking about high quality grain, which will leaven more quickly. The quality is how much chaff it has in it. So the more refined it is, the more just gluten it will have, which will make it rise more quickly. Okay, so to summarize, we had wheat 2, barley 3. The Natan says the opposite. Rabbi Yishmael says again, that was only 2 and 3 was talking about high grade. Low grade is 3 and 4. Now we're going to talk about the ratio between them. You see that wheat is going to be 50% more in low grade than high grade, whereas barley is 33% more, or you could say a quarter of the total less. So that's interesting that the ratios are in fact different. That's Rav Papa's point. Amar Rav Papa, Shema mina gedi'in chite chasichata mechite ma'aliyata tefe midigiri'in midigri'an sa'are chasichata misare ma'aliyata. The extent to which low quality is worse than high quality wheat is more than the extent to which low quality barley is worse than high quality barley. Because over there it's only a third of the total that you can use for low quality, right? A third of 3 is 1, so take away a third and you get 2. Whereas regarding barley, it's the difference is not as much, because from 4 to 3 is only a quarter of the total 4. All right, good. Now, Amarav Kaba melogna'a lefischa v'chen lechallah. Rav disagrees with all of these. These were, 2 kav or 3 kav, and he says no. It's 1 kav of that they use, the kind of measurement that they use in this place called melogna. Melogna. Some think that that Choni HaMe'agel, the famous sage who was known for drawing a circle around himself, that the Me'agel, was he called that when he was born, before he drew a circle around himself and demanded rain? Probably not. So that's actually a play on words. He was called Choni from Melogna. And then after he would draw circles around himself, that turned into a play on words at Choni HaMe'agel. Anyway, so it could be that he was from this place. In this place, they had a certain measurement and of a kab. And the Rav says that is the amount, the max amount you should bake on Pesach. And that's also the minimum amount that you need to be required to take Hallah. Okay. Now, hold on. Is that true? Some say it should be Tanan here. So that we have another place where it says 5 quarters of 5 quarters of a kab is and a little more. That's chayvin bekalaf. So he said 1 kav, and here he says 5/4 of a kav. So which one is it? Oh, it's actually the same. They had bigger measurements. So 1 kav from this place is the same as 5/4 of a kav from everywhere else. Amar Rav Yosef, Hane nashedidan lahogdal mefa kefiza lefischa. Okay, in order not to get to the maximum, he says, Rav Yosef says, our woman would bake 3/4 of a log at a time, a much smaller amount, so that it would be easier to handle. Amar le'abaye maidatich lechumra. Chumra date lide kulahu. Teka mafka la mehala. Abaye says, you think that's a good idea? You're being machmir by making a small batch at a time? Yeah, but every chumra has a kula on the other side of the coin. And here, because you're making small amounts at a time, you're not going to give hallah. And so you're kind of using a loophole to not give to not fulfill the mitzvah of hallah. No, we do give hallah because we follow the principle of Rabbi Eliezer. The Tanya Rabbi Eliezer, Omer Hadodeh Venoten lasal, hasal misarfan lehallah. This is a Mishnah. It says it Tanya. So some people correct it to Ditnan. Anyway, the Eliezer says, someone who is baking and puts them, after they're finished baking, gathers all the loaves into a basket. The basket joins them together to be the measurement of a hallah. So even though if I'm only baking a little bit at a time, let's say I have just a little oven, right? Baking a little at a time, once I gather everything in a basket, and it becomes the sufficient minimum, then I do bring hallah. And that's what we do. So although we're using a much smaller amount, we're putting them all in the same basket. We find that we do that the halacha. Good. So don't worry, we're not skimping out on the challah. We're doing challah also, and also being careful not to have big dough, so we don't violate chametz. מלא והייתם עלה, אמר רבי יהושע בן לוי לא שנו אלא כיכרות של בבל שנושכות זו מזו, אבל כאחין לא. Hold on, we said about that you can only follow this basket rule and join them together if they are Babylonian loaves. Babylonian loaves are like rolls that sometimes you buy and they're all stuck together and you got to kind of separate them. But if you didn't separate them, if you pull one, they would go along. So these they bite each other, right? They bake into each other. That's only the Babylonian rolls that they can join together when they're in the basket. But if they are like these long rod-like loaves that are separate, then you don't apply that principle. So how could you follow that Rabbi Eliezer's principle? As we can. And the Rabbi Chanina disagreed with Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. He says, yes, you can do it, even the separate loaves. It's fine. And they all will be required to have challah. Good. We said if you put them all in the basket, then they do join together to make the minimum requirement of challah. Well, what if it's not a basket but a board that has no rim? So would that also be okay? The word rim, it comes from Greek labis, which I wonder if is the same as the word lip. B and P are interchangeable. Anyway, if it's just a board, does it have to actually contain something, or just being together on a board would be sufficient? Or does it have to be inside a vessel? Then that's why. Or as long as they're sharing the same airspace, that's sufficient. Teko, we leave it as an open question. Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer Hasal Mesarfan, Rabbi Yehoshua Omer Tanur Mesarfan. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Kikarot shel Babel, shenoshchot zo mizo, mitztarefot. So 3 different opinions about if you are baking dough separately, how to join them together. Rabbi Eliezer says once they're finished baking, if you put them in the same basket, they nevertheless will be obligated to separate challah. Rabbi Yehoshua says if they're all in the oven together, even though you prepared the dough separately, then the being in the oven together will join. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says if they're like the Babylonian loaves that are stuck to each other, those also join together. Okay, so that's the end. Right, so that's combining laws for challah, and now we're going to have 2 more mishnayot today. The next one is about a 3-woman assembly line. This is some good advice to how to bake masot together when you have a lot of people and yet only one oven. We'll see some different opinions. Okay, let's just jump into that. Rabban Gamliel omer shalosh nashim lashot ke'achat ve'ofot betanur ehad zo achar zo. The 3 women, they all want to bake their own masot at the same time. Rabban Gamliel says that's fine. They can all start off and start kneading and then shaping the dough. And now only one of assuming they're making a batch, that only one of their batches will fit in the oven at once. So one woman will put hers in the oven. It will bake, and the other ones are just waiting around. And then when she's done, the second one will put in the oven, and the third, and one of them was still waiting around. And he says that's okay. In other words, 3 would be the max. So let's assume, how long does it take to bake a masa? David, you've done it about 5 minutes.
I would guess 5 minutes.
Okay, so let's say 5 minutes. So that's fine, right? The first one goes in right away. The last one is waiting around for 10 minutes. That's okay. It's still less than 18 minutes. Okay, obviously it's going to depend on how hot the oven is, how thick the dough is. It's going to depend on a lot of things. But he's saying, on average, this would be just fine. חכמים אומרים 3 נשים עוסקות בבשר כאחת, אחת לאשה ואחת עורכת ואחת עופה. So the sages say, no, make an assembly line, right? If you have 3, so let one start doing the kneading. When she's done kneading, then the next one can start kneading, and the first one will start making the dough. Then when she's done, the first one will put it in the oven. The second one will start forming the loaves, and then the last woman will start kneading. And that way, you every batch is going directly into the oven as soon as they are ready, and they can repeat. Good. Rabbi Akiva omer lo kol hanashim v'lo kol ha'asim v'lo kol ha'tanurim shavin. Zeh kelal tafach tiltosh basoneh. And Rabbi Akiva says you can't make a rule. Every woman, it depends on the woman, how fast they work, what kind of trees there are, the fuel. Some is hotter, some is colder. Some ovens are hotter and colder, and so you can't. There's no way to give one blanket rule. It could be that you'd have more could do it at the same time, less could do it at the same time. It all depends on the circumstances. So rather, all you have to do is look at the dough. If it begins to rise, then spread cold water on it, and that'll stop it. And as long as you keep doing that, you can make sure you won't have chametz. All right, that's 3 opinions in the Mishnah. I mean, the third opinion is really like don't have a rule, right? Just a rule of thumb. Just look at it and make sure it doesn't rise. Tenora banan lasha hi mekatefet vechaberta lasha tachteha. Okay, this is going to explain the assembly line a little bit further. So the woman is kneading first. She finishes her kneading, and she starts arranging her dough, and then the second woman will start kneading. Mekatefet, she's done forming the loaf. Hi ofa vechaberta mekatefet tachteha. So she will bake, put it in the oven, and then the one who was kneading will now form the dough. And the third one will start baking, will start kneading. And you keep doing that and go round and round. And this is very good because as long as you are dealing with the dough, as long as you're handling it, it's not going to become leaven. So, even if they're slow and they're taking a lot of time to knead it, that's fine. It won't leaven as long as it's not sitting around unattended. Rabbi Akiva omer lo kol hanashim Tanya Amar Rabbi Akiva danti lifnei Rabban Gamliel. Right, Rabban Gamliel, remember, is the one that said all 3 could do it at the same time. Each stage, all 3 will knead at the same time, and then all 3 will form the dough, and then 2 of them will wait around. So the Rabbi Akiva kind of questioned and discussed this with Rabban Gamliel. He says, teach us, Master, Yilamdenu Rabenu, benashim zirizot, or benashim she'en zirizot, ba'asim lachim, or ba'asim yebeshim, betanur ham, or betanur sonen. אמר לי, אין לך אלא מה ששנו חכמים, זה הכלל, תפח תלטוש בסונן. He says, I want to know exactly what you mean by having the 3 women. Are they very diligent, steadfast, and are quick, or are they slow? Is it moist wood, which burns cool, or dry wood that burns hot? Is it very hot oven or a cool oven? Like, what are their criteria? He said, the only criteria is make sure it doesn't become hametz, and if it's beginning to rise, then put cold water. So Rabban Gamliel is actually also in the name of Rabbi Akiva is saying his non-principle also in the name of Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel is giving a general average, but if you look into the matter, the actual circumstances, Rabbi Akiva says, it could be different. It could be more or it could be less. All right, and last Mishnah, we're going to be discussing the different stages of leavening. We actually quoted this Mishnah a few dapim ago regarding something called si'ur. Si'ur is not to be confused with se'or. Se'or is sourdough leavening agent. Si'ur means that something that began to leaven but not yet finished. It's in the middle, within the process. And the question is, how far along the process of leavening is actually considered prohibited, and then prohibited with karet? That's the question. So we're going to see the Mishnah is going to quote Rabbi Yehudah and the sages. Rabbi Yehudah is lenient, the sages are stringent. And then we're going to quote a Baraita that has Rabbi Meir being stringent and the sages being lenient. So this is quite interesting when you have the sages according to the Mishnah, Chachamim being stringent and the Baraita being lenient. We'll try to figure out why that is. Si'ur yisaref. Si'ur is the first stage when it begins to leaven, has to be burnt. V'achlo patur, but if you did eat it at that stage, no punishment. Siduk yisaref. V'achlo chayav karet. Siduk, which means cracking, if it starts to crack, then also you have to burn it. And at that point, if someone who eats it is liable to karet. So siduk means it's already fully hametz. Now, what are these stages? How do we define these stages? Ezeu siur kekarneh hagabim. If it begins to crack like antennas of a locust, right? So that there's that certain size, and you see a bunch of cracks, then that's called siur. Siduk shnit arabu sedakim ze bazeh dibre Rabbi Yehudah. Once the cracks get bigger and intermingled, that's when it becomes fully chametz and you be chayav karet. Which means, according to the Yehudah, he's rather lenient. Even if you start having lots of cracks, a few cracks, then you don't get karet yet, right? So he tolerates some cracks. Hachamim omrim ze vazeh ha'ochlo chayav karet. There's no either of these stages, any cracks at all, whether a few cracks or intermingled cracks, both of those are considered fully chametz. Those are both siduk, and those you get karet. Ve'ezehu siur. What is the first level of siur that you're not yet liable to karet? Kol shechsifu panav kadam shamdu sarotav. That's when the top of it becomes pale. It starts drying out. It becomes pale, like a person whose hair stands on end because he's afraid. I've never actually seen someone's hair stand on end except in cartoons, but it must be based on something because they didn't have cartoons and they still had this expression. Anyway, someone who's so pale, right? If you see that, that's the first stage at which you have to burn it. You cannot make it into kosher matzah anymore. But if you eat it, it's not yet karet. Okay, so that's the sages who you see are more stringent. They say only if it becomes pale, then no karet. But any cracks that start, that's already karet. Good. Tenor banan. Now we have the Baraita that has a bit of a different combination. Ezehu siur kol shechsifu fanav kadam shamdu sarotav. Okay, that's the opinion of the Chachamim in the Mishnah. So just siur means if it became just pale, then no karet yet. Siduk kekaneh hagabim dibre Rabbi Meir. And siduk cracking is just the beginning of cracking, just antenna lines. That is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. So we see Rabbi Meir is the same as the Chachamim in the Mishnah. That is actually typical, right? Very often we say a stam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, although it's not a stam Mishnah. It's Chachamim was kind of even stronger than a stam Mishnah. Okay, so that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who is stringent. And then the Baraita quotes Chachamim Omerim Ezehu Siur Kekarneh Hagabim Siduk Shenit Arabu Sedakim Ze Bazeh. So they say that siur, the first level, it's not karet. That's when you already have a few lines. And then siduk, when you do have karet, that's when the lines intermingle. So you see, that's the lenient opinion. Good. And now we end off with the statement ze vazeh hachlo chayav karet. Either one, both of these criteria, either a few cracks or many cracks, someone who eats it is chayav karet. Now that's strange because this last line doesn't fit well with Chachamim just now, right? This line seems to fit better with Rabbi Meir, which is exactly what we're going to say now. patur dibre Rabbi Yehudah. Ema Rabbi Meir zevazeh ha'ochlo chayav karet. All right, so we said in the Mishnah the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah. Let's look here. Right, Rabbi Yehudah was one that's lenient. And that is similar to Chachamim here, and yet you're going to say, and he said, if you eat it patur, and that would be the same as the sages here. So how could you say either one is chayav when you just said that one of them would be patur? So rather, the last line must be actually modifying to be meir, and that would make sense because v'achlo zeh vazeh achlo chayav karet. Right, and over here it is in fact Chachamim that say that phrase, and Chachamim is the same as Rabbi Meir. Okay, good. So we clarified that. And last point, Amar Rava, my tamad Rabbi Meir, And lecha kol sedek v'sedek milamala she'en lo kama sedekim milamata. But the reason Rabbi Meir is stringent and says even if you have a few lines, you already consider it chametz, is because it's impossible to have a few lines on top without there being many more lines underneath, many more cracks. And so he agrees that essentially chametz is defined as when you have many intermingled cracks, but even a few cracks on the top is evidence of intermingled cracks within the dough, and that's why he is stringent. Good. So just a theory about what happened here. How are the sages stringent here and lenient in the Baraita? It seems to be that the Mishnah and the Baraita have a machloket between themselves about which one should be halacha lemaaseh. So the Mishnah thinks that we should be stringent halacha lemaaseh. So the Yehudah Nasi took the opinion of Rabbi Meir, the minority opinion of Rabbi Meir, and presented it as chachamim in order to indicate that that is the halacha lemaaseh. Whereas the Baraita seemed to want to say that halacha should be lenient, and therefore took Rabbi Yehudah's opinion and presented as Chachamim to be the lenient one. Originally, it was two opinions: Rabbi Yehudah and Rabbi Meir. What do all the other sages say? I don't know. We don't have record of it. Right? Saying Chachamim say this is the equivalent of putting a marker that this should be the halacha lema'aseh. And that is the end of this Mishnah. Tomorrow we begin the next one. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.